So, as I said, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but last weekend, millions of people around the world marked Mandela Day across schools, workplaces, and communities. And people gave, as I said, 67 minutes of service, symbolizing the 67 years which Nelson Mandela devoted to the struggle for justice. Now, it's going to be very hard for me to read this sermon without choking up, not just because of Mandela, but because of where we find ourselves in the world today. So forgive me if I break up every now and then, but I'm sure I share the same tears as you. And I'm deeply moved by being able to bring this service to you today. We tell his story very often. We remember the young lawyer, the Rivonia trial in which he was sentenced to life imprisonment, 27 years of imprisonment. We remember the first democratic elections in 1994. We remember the smiling president wearing, as I said, the national rugby jersey and changing his nation in that single moment. We remember his receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And these stories deserve to be told again and again and again. However, I'd also like us to ask a different question, and that is not just what did Mandela accomplish, but what kind of inner life made those accomplishments possible? Because history often celebrates public achievements while overlooking the spiritual, moral, and ethical disciplines that make those achievements possible. As we know, great leaders are not simply born, they are formed. And Mandela was formed by many streams of wisdom. As Unitarian Universalists, we often speak about drawing from many wells. And we do not believe that truth belongs to one religion or one tradition alone. Instead, we proudly recognize that wisdom appears wherever human beings are seeking compassion, justice, and love. And Mandela's life beautifully illustrates this. His spirituality was never confined to one single tradition. Instead, it became, I would like to think, almost like a tapestry woven from many threads. So I'd like to share 4 of those threads with you this morning and a closing thought. And so I do have to acknowledge that the first thread that influenced the man who was to become the icon, Nelson Mandela, he attended Methodist school, so he identified initially as a Christian, especially throughout his youth. And he later wrote that it was the missionaries who educated him, and they gave him a love of learning, of discipline, and service. Of course, all of this in the backdrop of a segregated world. Let us not forget that. And although he would eventually move beyond conventional Christianity, those early teachings definitely remained with him, especially this one, Jesus' command to love one's enemies. It's one of the most difficult teachings ever offered to humanity. Most of us admire it, but in reality, of course, few of us can actually practice it. But Mandela lived it. He spent those 27 years imprisoned by a government that sought to crush his spirit. Yet, when he emerged, people in many ways expected some kind of revenge. Instead, they encountered a man who was seeking reconciliation. And this was not a political strategy alone. It was spiritual maturity. He understood that hatred imprisons the person who carries it. And whether or not he ever used these exact words, there's a famous saying which is attributed to him, and it captures, I believe, this truth beautifully. It goes like this: resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. And whether or not Mandela coined these words, whatever their origin, that in a way is less important than, of course, the wisdom that they express. Forgiveness for Mandela was never about pretending that injustice had not occurred. He never once suggested forgetting apartheid. In fact, quite the opposite. Instead, he insisted on truth, and he insisted on accountability. And he, of course, supported the famous Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took 2 years to unfold underneath the jurisdiction, of course, of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he did this precisely because truth mattered. But he also knew that justice without healing simply creates new victims. And his vision, along with Tutu's and others, was to create a loving and safe space for people at the TRC to share their stories, express their sorrows, their pain, their losses, their grief, and to tell the truth, and to have people listen to that truth, be forced to listen to it, in fact. He wanted, and they wanted, to give chance for the perpetrators as well to confess their wrongdoings, ask for forgiveness. So Mandela and people like Tutu, of course, were demonstrating over and over again that forgiveness was not weakness, it was freedom. So the second thread comes from Africa itself. So long before missionaries arrived, African communities had cultivated rich moral traditions. And as we know as a community, perhaps one of the best known is Ubuntu. We've spoken about it a lot. I am because we are. I am because you are. In other words, human beings do not exist as isolated individuals. Our humanity is created through relationship. And even after decades in prison, Mandela refused to divide humanity into permanent categories of enemies and friends. He believed that people could change because he himself had changed. And he believed also that communities could heal. But there's another thing. The traditional African justice was often less concerned with punishment rather than restoring broken relationships. So hear me out on this one. It's something I've not mentioned before, but I wanted to bring it to today's service. And that is when harm occurs somewhere in a community, in traditional African communities, the question was not simply who should suffer. It was, how do we make the community whole again? Now there's a word, it's a Zulu and Xhosa word, and it's this. It's a simple word, but it's a very powerful word. Indaba, indaba. And it's a word that is used to describe a community meeting. And primarily, this is for discussing major issues or problems that are affecting the whole community. Now, as we know in the West, our kinds of meetings very often are optimized for speed, and very often too, it's the loudest that gets heard. Indaba, on the other hand, takes much, much longer. Why? Or let me explain. Everyone has the opportunity to speak, and everyone commits to listening. And disagreement is recorded and not just absorbed by majority rule. So it takes time and perseverance, but the payoff is real and long-lasting because Indaba has shown through the centuries, and get this, that when everyone is heard, the decisions that are made invariably stick. Imagine how different our politics, our workplaces, even our families might look if restoration became more important than punishment. If everyone was heard. My colleague here in Cape Town, we worked together for the Cape Town Interfaith Initiative. He told me that part of the liberation struggle came through conversations, believe it or not, and conversations about those conversations. In other words, listening to each other is akin to struggling through towards eventually a change of mind and heart. So the third thread comes from Gandhi. And as some of you may know, Gandhi lived for a time in South Africa. There's a very large Indian population in the city of Durban, which is on the eastern coast of South Africa. And that's where Gandhi went to after finishing training as a lawyer in London. And decades before Mandela's imprisonment, Gandhi developed there in South Africa the philosophy of satyagraha. In other words, the force of truth expressed through non-violent resistance. And that was born out of a racist incident that Gandhi experienced that he'd never experienced in his childhood or adult life on a train in South Africa that was to change his life and ultimately our world forever. Now, Mandela admired Gandhi enormously, and history, of course, became more complicated than just peaceful non-violence. Eventually, Mandela concluded that peaceful protest alone could not overcome the violence of apartheid. And in many instances, there were forms of resistance, physical resistance. Yet, both Gandhi and Mandela believed that every human being possesses inherent dignity, and neither wanted merely to defeat an opponent. They wanted to transform society, and both understood that means and ends cannot be completely separated. In other words, how we struggle shapes the world we create. Think about that. Perhaps it's one of the hardest lessons for our own time. Things such as social media encourages us to opine all the time and win arguments rather than understand people. Political life, as we know, is loud, aggressive, angry, fraught, divisive, polarizing. But Mandela offered another way. Firm convictions, deep courage, and never forgetting the humanity of those with whom we disagree. So a fourth thread is something that we've spoken about often, but I just wanted to give a Mandela twist to it, if I may. The fourth thread was hope, not optimism, hope. And of course, as we know, that there is an important difference. Optimism says, eventually everything will turn out fine. But hope says, I will continue working for what is right, whether success seems likely or not. And that bears great gravitas when it comes from a man who was denied his own freedom for 27 years. In fact, given a life imprisonment, never thought he would see freedom again in his lifetime. Optimism, therefore, depends very often on our circumstances, but hope depends on our character. And when I was preparing today's service, I remembered a quote which I'd like to share with you. And it's unclear exactly who to accurately attribute this quote to, but nevertheless, it's important for me to share in this context. You may be familiar with it. It's this: watch your thoughts, for they become words. Watch your words, for they become actions. Watch your actions, for they become habits. Watch your habits, for they become your character. And watch your character, for it becomes your destiny. When I went to Robben Island for the first time, I have to tell you that part of the tour, of course, you get to see his cell, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. But there's an exercise yard, small exercise yard outside the solitary confinement areas. And on two sides of the exercise yard was a tiny strip of earth that the prisoners turned into a garden. And there was one section that was known as Mandela's Garden. And I think that it was that moved me the most. It was just no bigger than a square foot. And what Mandela had done is collected seeds from his food and planted those. And I think what struck me was, how does one commit to nurturing the essence of life in the midst of so much injustice and cruelty? Imagine waking every morning in those same four walls of the prison cell. Imagine knowing that your children are growing up without you. Imagine years unfolding into decades. So what I think I came to realize in that moment is that hope under those conditions is not emotion. It's a discipline. And Mandela himself once wrote that courage is not the absence of fear, but triumph over it. And I believe hope works in the same way. It's not the absence of despair, because let's face it, many of us feel this on a consistent basis. But he's saying it's not the absence of despair. It's choosing instead not to surrender, to that despair. And that's what the garden, I think, impacted me the most. And perhaps it's the lesson that our world needs most today. Many of us feel overwhelmed by war, climate change, inequality, polarization, and just a general uncertainty about everything. And so it's tempting to withdraw, to become sometimes maybe even cynical, or basically to resign oneself and say, nothing can change. But Mandela reminds us that history has often been changed by people who refused to give up before the breakthrough became visible. In closing, I'd like to add one final thought. And it's a spiritual practice that I think unites all of these traditions, and that's listening. Now, those who knew Mandela often remarked that he listened before speaking. Imagine. He would often allow everyone else to contribute before he offered his own opinion. And he understood something simple and profound, that listening is not just waiting for your turn to speak. Listening is an act of respect and honoring of one another's humanity. It's a declaration in a way that another person's experience actually matters. I personally believe that genuine listening is one of the greatest forms of love. Our world has plenty of voices. We know that. But what I think is lacking most is listeners. And I wonder, can we commit to being better listeners? Can I commit to it? As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm, of course, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And we honor another's dignity, I think. And Mandela showed the way by listening deeply enough to recognize that their humanity, understanding another one's pain, giving space for another person's story, assuming nothing, then, and also, I think, realizing that we are complex beings. We're not just one thing. And sometimes it's so easy to box people like that. So where does this leave us? Well, as I said, Mandela was shaped by Christianity's call to love, by Ubuntu's vision of shared humanity and interconnectedness, of Indaba's method of letting all voices be heard, by Gandhi's moral courage, by hope that refused despair, and by forgiveness that liberated rather than excused. It's a very fine line there. And by showing that listening builds trust. And of course, none of these qualities belong to Mandela alone. I'm not saying that. And none belong exclusively to Christianity or African traditional practices or Hinduism or any other religion. They are, in fact, just part of humanity's shared spiritual inheritance. And the good news is, of course, that it's available to every one of us. I'd like to close with this final thought, that Mandela Day is often, as I said, summarized by 67 minutes of service. It's a beautiful tradition. But perhaps the greater invitation here is not merely to give 67 minutes once a year, but rather to spend our lives cultivating the kind of character that makes those 67 minutes meaningful. The world does not just need more heroes. It needs more people, and that includes us and includes me, who practice forgiveness when resentment feels easier, who choose hope when cynicism feels also easier, who listen before judging, who seek restoration before revenge, and who remember that our humanity is inescapably bound together, all of us. Mandela said, and I quote him, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And perhaps the most impossible task before each of us is that we can't change the world overnight. I think we all know that. Perhaps instead it's allowing ourselves to be changed day by day into people through whom justice, compassion, and reconciliation can quietly seep into the world. This, I think, is the deepest legacy of Mandela. Not simply that he transformed a nation, but that he showed us how one human soul, and so of course that includes us, is shaped by many streams of wisdom and can become a force for healing. My prayer is this, that may we have the courage to begin that same journey, or I think many of us have begun it, perhaps better to say, continue that same journey for ourselves, for others, for our nation, and for our world. Let it be so, and so it is. Thank you.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.